Chapter 57 The Woods. I'd been overconfident. The gnolls had been a convenience, angry, starving convenience, but convenience all the same. The forest was a different thing. Hexa had warned me while we ghosted between the black spines of the conifers. Mana density here was easily a full order higher than anything we'd seen outside Volume's lair, and the weave hung so close to the world that the sky felt like a lid of living light. That meant old things lived under these boughs. Big things. Things that had been drinking deep for centuries. Central vector in the lattice, Hexa murmured in my head, her voice pitched low, clinical. Predator density modeled at 3 times your prior baseline. Think like an ant among frogs. I did, right up until the forest decided to correct me. The warning was a soft thud in the soil, felt rather than heard, an eddy in the loam that grazed my bare heel. The child of Yin tugged at me, that instinctive whisper he's always been, left, and I obeyed without arguing. The world blurred. A shadow longer than a wagon and thick as a man's torso punched through the ferns where I'd been standing, mouth first, a wedge of wet darkness rimmed by recurved fangs. The air screamed around it with the speed of the strike. The strike missed me by a hand's breadth and split a large sapling like paper. Threat, Apex Coil Serpent, L37, blinked across my inner vision in Hexa's neat, merciless font. Length tilde 9 meters. Primary vector, ambush strike. Secondary vectors, constriction, caudal bludgeon. Venom profile, mixed, neurotoxic with monoreactive cofactors. Do not be bitten. I didn't plan on it. The serpent flowed past, a living cable wrapped in hammered, gunmetal scales engraved with hairline sigils that flickered with heatless blue. Its head was shovel-broad and plated, pits where eyes should be bulged like pearls of opal, heat sense organs bloated by mana. The tongue tasted, a tatter of black ribbon. It tasted me. Position, Hexa snapped. On it. I let the shadows take my weight. Shadowgate was a long shot. I had an idea of what should happen and how the trap worked. It wasn't quite right, not like the old theory lectures promised, but space folded enough to smear me sideways a body length as the tail scythed through. The whip crack of it hit where my ribs had been, struck a tree with a meaty, splintering thud, and showered the understory with needles. HP -84. Fine, I hissed between my teeth, already moving. Pain was just a color now, a temperature in the water I lived in. I slung a graviton trap low and wide, a knotted thread of bent space that humped like a plucked wire and made pinecones hop in a ring. The serpent corrected mid-flow with obscene grace, a muscle rope looping itself around a trunk and pouring back at me, mouth yawning, palatal glands pulsing. I saw the venom gather in the black, then missed out on a spray, invisible until it hit the humid air and bloomed into a shimmering cloud. Do not breathe, Hexa said, flat as a firing pin. I inverted the trap. Gravity isn't just down. It's direction. I forced a point of absolute down half a meter ahead of me, and the venom cloud kinked towards it like smoke trapped in a bottle, condensed into a glassy tear that sank and fattened and jittered at my feet. It pulsed a sickly violet in the weave glow, hungry to aerosolize again. Cute, Hexa allowed, a shard of approval. Thanks. New trick. File it under do not try that indoors. The serpent crashed the edge of the trap and slowed, its momentum bleeding into a shiver along its coils. That was all the tempo I needed. I let the void breathe. Void oppression rolled out of me in a low tide, no sound, no color, just a density in the air that made every needle's shatter look longer, darker, more final. It pressed on scales and sap and bone, on heartbeat and breath. The serpent's neck dipped a fraction monofractals on its scales flickering. I moved. The child of Yin tugged again, now, and I listened. I went in barehanded, because that's what I had, and called the bite of my favorite sin down my forearms. You don't cast the void that licks so much as you invite it to dinner and hope it's in a mood to eat with knives. Black radiance crawled over my skin, a satin sheen that drank the world where it touched. The void licked the air, tasting, and everything it tasted began to forget it had ever existed at the edges. The nearest fir needles browned and curled. Bark dulled. The serpent's scales where my hands grabbed them went matte, then wrong, as if the idea of scale was being unwritten from the outside inward. The void didn't burn. It eroded. The serpent felt its soul get its first paper cut and went mad. It folded in on itself with whiplash violence, body looping, the tail bludgeoning the world with concussive thumbs. I clamped down at the hinge of its jaw, the other hand braced against the plate of its head, and rode the convulsion like a man learning to stand on a moving ship. My blood sang with the old friend in it. Pain. Familiar as the shape of my own mouth. Jaw strength modeled at. A lot, Hexa said dryly. Do not be inside when it closes. I'm working on outside. It tried to bite its own neck to get at me, a white flash of fangs. I slipped a palm width, the teeth knitting together with a noise like a chisel hammered into stone, and punched my other hand, void sheathed, between the plate and the skull. The lick ate scale, then dermis, then cartilage, and the smell came on in an instant, not blood, not rot, but ozone and old museums, the scent of lacquered bones and static. Status, Apex Coil Serpent, Soul Integrity -7%. Oh, that got its attention. The serpent slammed sideways, wrapped me in coils, and crushed. My spine creaked like a bow under strain. The ground barked under my shoulder. Black stars scattered across the inside of my eyelids. HP -156. Void barricade, Hexa ordered, percussive. I spat a laugh and flared it. The barrier didn't manifest as a wall so much as a refusal, a wedge of refusal between my ribs and the coil. No, it told the world. Not closer than this. The squeeze hit its limit and held. The tail came hunting for my head, blind but furious. I saw the muscular ripple, felt the wind of it, and kicked a graviton thread into its path. The tail met the edge of a robust conifer and kinked, slamming down offline, crushing the venom bead from before instead. The glassy tear splashed and hissed, eating a shallow hole in the loam. The scent that came out of it was wrong, sweet and metallic and blue. Venom cofactors are monoreactive, Hexa said, quick. If it gets in you, adapt now. I didn't argue. I shoved power into mono-adaptable blood, and the world ticked. It's a horrible skill if you hate the wet, intimate parts of yourself. My blood learned. It altered as I told it to, proteins folding, membranes primed to bind, to neutralize, to carry. Heat ticked up along my veins, my marrow ached with the sudden shift in work order. Beta chains, gamma chains, make them sticky in the right places. The child of Yin shivered in me, he always does when I instruct my meat to stop obeying the usual rules, and then purred. He liked the audacity of it. The serpent flexed. The coil tightened. The barricade screamed voicelessly, friction without movement, and I felt the give in my shoulder girdle creep and then stop. Fine. Enough defense. Throat, Hexa said. Soft palate. Pit cluster under the frontal plate. Or tear the soul, your choice. Why not both? I let greed open in me. It's not taking, not like the word implies. It's siphoning. I gullet open to a storm. The serpent's mantle blazed, the sigils along the scales lighting like 1,000 tiny stove eyes, and I drank. Its mana rushed my way in a hot, heady flood, tinted with its urge to kill. My own reserves leapt. Mana plus 220. The serpent's pressure faltered for a heartbeat, surprise is universal, and I stabbed that heartbeat with a knife of gravity. I hung a point of collapse inside its mouth. The trick of graviton trap is where you put the well. Outside it drags bodies. Inside it drags things that don't have the same idea of adherence. Flesh is mostly water sewn together with protein. I made a palm size down above the serpent's windpipe and watched the soft palate slurp around it like soup around a spoon. The hiss that came out of the serpent was wrong, wet, serrated, then blood misted around its fangs and it really lost its temper. It let go of constriction to get space to writhe. That was the opening I needed. I slipped along its own shadow, 2 short steps around the curve of its neck, and came up onto the head plate. Void that licks had already chalked a bruise on the sole. I pressed hard on that bruise and pushed the lick down. The void doesn't tear like claws. It tongues. It persists. It tells the real that there are other, better options than continuing to be what it is. The plate dulled. Then it pitted. Then the idea of plate floated a fraction of a millimeter away from the idea of skull and the serpent's soul said no, please, and the lick said hush. Status, Apex Coil Serpent, Soul Integrity -22%. It went berserk. Tail whip, coil, lunge, buck, 9 meters of rage and pain and old hunger. The forest thumped in time with it. A fur cracked and went down, shedding cones like hail. It struck at itself to get at me and split the air where my head used to be. I slid under the chin and jammed my fingers into the pit cluster, those opal pearls of sense, and gave the void a new path to walk. Something important inside it began to consume itself. Status, Soul Integrity -41%. Hold, Hexa said softly. It wasn't an order. It was faith. I held. The child of Yin giggled, he does that, delighted by knives in the dark, and guided my next step, not the obvious throat tear. The kiss at the coil. I shifted half a meter, laid my palm to the ring of body a meter back from the skull, and opened the lick wide, wide, until the air around my hand blurred and the hairs on my arm stood up. The lick ate scale. Then tendon. Then it lapped at the serpent's life, and the serpent felt it where it mattered. Status, -62%. It tried to flee. Which is to say, it tried to not be here anymore. The whole length convulsed back, trying to drag itself. I didn't let it go. Oppression weighed it down. The gravity well in its mouth dragged. My hand drank. Its soul thinned like sugar in a hot drink. Now, Hexa breathed. I rammed a void barricade, a sliver, straight through the coil. The barricade is refusal, and refusal is sharp if you make it thin enough. It went in like a plate of night and came out the other side like a keystone. The serpent tried to close around it and couldn't. It tried to be whole and couldn't. Something had to give, and what gave was its idea of one continuous piece. Silence fell into the space the serpent had occupied. It was loud silence. Pressure dropping. Trees settling. The scent of ozone and iron and resin thick in my throat. EXP plus 2480, Skill Mastery, Void that licks plus 0.6%, Combat Insight, Predator's Rhythm, Minor, plus 3% evasion for 10 minutes. Hexa's approval slid across my thoughts. Clean registration. No drift, no desync. You're sitting at level 19, 62%. 2 more of those and you'll ding. I rolled my shoulders and let my breath out long and slow. The bruises sang in a dozen keys. My ribs would purple. 100 shallow cuts I hadn't noticed until I stopped moving found their voices. The ache was almost luxurious. Analysis, I said, eyeing the corpse. Level 37, old growth, locally dominant apex, Hexa said, almost cheerful. She gets that way when we live through something we shouldn't, like a proud parent and a lab tech rolled into one. Venom's interesting, there's an organelle in the matrix that wants to catalyze with ambient mana. Good you didn't let it find a bloodstream. Your adaptable blood template should now have a base binding for this region's toxin families. Also, nice use of micro-wells. Note, that trick will not endear you to civilized sewer systems. You're assuming we'll be welcome in a city anytime soon, I said, and put a hand on the serpent's head. The plate under my palm was cool now, the lick's kiss having erased its memory of heat. Harvest? You're naked and lack containers. Problem, not impossibility. The child of Yun pushed a thought through me so gently it felt like my own cloak. A practical urge. I agreed. I slit the skin along the grain where the void had made the scales tender and peeled a panel loose with a grunt. It came away like old wallpaper, wet and heavy, a sheet of pale leather with the ghost of scales patterned on one side. I shook it out and threw it around my shoulders. It stuck at first, blood is glue, and then settled. Primitive. Warm. Adequate. Fashion crimes aside, Hexa said primly, note the sigils etched in the scale edges. Whoever seeded this forest encouraged certain apex morphologies with rune micro-engraving. This region is managed. Possibly sanctified. Which implies there are intelligences. People? People mean walls. Walls mean shops, I said. Shops mean pants. Delightful priorities. I crouched and looked at the head again, considering. The venom bead had eaten a saucer out of the forest floor. The sigils along the serpent's side had gone dull with death, but they were still a language. A recipe. If I could only read them. The forest exhaled. Then inhaled again. The silence that had followed the kill broke the way glass breaks, first hairline, then all at once. Cicadas started up in a ragged gutter along the ravine. Something small, smaller than me, anyway, darted from under a fern and vanished under a log. Far off, 3 measured thuds came like someone dropping stones the size of altars onto moss. Subsonic, Hexa said. 260 meters, closing. Mass estimate. Heavy. Heavier than the last one. Friends of your ant frog analogy? Cousins. I straightened and rolled the makeshift cloak tighter around my shoulders. The child of Yin leaned forward inside me like a boy on a railing, eager and unafraid. Retreat? Hexa asked, the tiniest edge of test in it. She already knew the answer. Move, I said. We went tree to tree, shadow to shadow, letting the night do what it's always done for me, swallow, soften, make me a rumor. The thuds got louder. Whatever was coming was not subtle. It didn't need to be. Detour 5 degrees, Hexa advised. There's a change in the ground, less stone, more root. Better for foot traction if we need to run. I took her line, hopping between trunks, keeping the carcass behind us has allowed a story for the forest to tell. The air cooled by a degree and then 2, the way it does near water. The scent changed too, resin giving way to iron and old leaves. The weave's light ribbon through a break in the canopy ahead, blue and soft, painting a low fog with saints' halos. Something moved in that fog, low and broad, with shoulders too tall for a wolf and a head like an anvil. Not 1. 3. Mana bears, Hexa said, flat again. Level 30s. Scars of prior unrestricted contact. They smell your work and want the theme to continue. The child of Yin tugged now with both hands. We moved. I palmed a shard of bark and painted a thin crescent of void that licks across it, an invisible, hungry smear, and slapped it onto a fallen trunk. Hexa ticked time in my ear as I wedged a graviton trap into the hollow beneath, a silent well ready to misweight anything foolish enough to press. A wafer-thin void barricade went up 2 strides beyond, angled like a pane of black glass to catch a charging shoulder. I threw a strip of blood-wet snake-hide past the setup, let greed flare for a heartbeat so the scent of me soaked the air, then smothered it. Bait set. We slid backward through a shadow 12 long strides sideways in the world, disappearing behind a screen of furs just as the brush exploded. 3 bears, storm-black and starving, hit the clearing like boulders kicked by a god. The first swiped at the scent and smashed its paw against the barricade. The impact rang and turned its momentum sideways into the trunk I'd lacquered. The lick kissed fur and went to work, no scream, just a confused ball as matter forgot itself. The second plunged a forelimb into the graviton well and found its bones answering a different map. The third hesitated, then committed anyway because hunger talks louder than wisdom. For a breath they were all fury and confusion in the awful grind of teeth on nothing. We were already gone, ghosting the opposite vector, feet soft, breaths counted. The forest grew quiet. You need food, water, shelter, clothing, a sack to put things in, a map, a conversation that isn't with me. Wall, then. Wall. The child of Yin sulked briefly. He wanted 3 more fights and a crown of bones, then relented. I patted the serpent skin tighter around my shoulders and started toward the scent of water. It's always where the smart animals go, and where there are smart animals there are sometimes smarter bipeds putting stones in stacks. Trees thinned. The ground sloped. The fog strengthened. The weave's glow was a ribbon skimming a river now, blue smeared on black. A bend opened, cluttered with driftwood and the bones of trees the floods had taken. Just then figures detached from the trees without sound. Cloaks that weren't cloth flowed around them, woven shadow layered over lacquered plates the color of oil on water. Faces half-veiled, skin like midnight shot through with the faintest undertone of violet where witchlight kissed cheekbones. Eyes reflective as beetle carapace. Bows were already strung, blades were already drawn. They moved as if the forest had made them to fit its seams. They had heard us before we decided to be heard. The first rank parted and a scout stepped forward, taller than me by a handspan, hair bound in a crown of braided silver thread, pauldrons shaped like serrated leaves. She carried a spear of blackwood grown in a spiral, its head thin as a thought and twice as sharp. The witchlight behind her gave no heat. She looked at me the way a surgeon looks at a problem. Her gaze sifted layers, my cloak that wasn't a cloak, the serpent hide, bare feet black with sap, eyes too bright for the dark. When she spoke, it was a low, liquid tongue that rolled like water across smooth stone. Hexa translated with a flick. Name. Allegiance. Purpose. Pants, I said aloud, because humor is a weapon and I had few others I was willing to show. The child of Yin giggled, and 3 bows creaked, not in mirth. The scout's head tilted a fraction. She answered in the human tongue, accent precise, contempt carefully sheathed. You will have covering, outsider, if you come without malice and keep your hands where we can count them. Her eyes cut to the tree line we had bled. The forest says you hunted. The forest says you were hunted. It wasn't wrong, I said. I let the void settle around my fingers and then let it go, an honest show of nothing. I need a fire, a map, and trousers. In that order. She considered that, and the line of shadows behind her adjusted minutely, angles of bows, distribution of weight, a quiet choreography of lethal etiquette. Then she beckoned with 2 fingers. Witchlights drifted, unmoored from branches, and slid ahead like will-o-wisps marking a path. We are car set, she said. Ward camp of the 3rd route. You will walk where we tell you, speak when asked, and touch nothing that gleams. If you lie, the we will know. If you steal, the trees will keep you. We moved under their escort, deeper into the blue-black, and the camp resolved out of the trees like a flock alighting, never fixed, always ready to leap. There were no walls. No palisade. No perimeter but the angle of watchful eyes and the soft tension of tripcords strung between trunks at shin height, bright as spider silk in my sight for a heartbeat as Hexa and I marked them and then they were gone. Platforms had been coaxed from living boughs, not cut, grown into broad, springy saddles by patient art, bridged with braids of ivy lacquered in pitch. Tents weren't tents so much as petals of obsidian silk that clung to roots and uncurled from bone-like frames, their seams stitched with wire that drank moonlight and refused to shine back. The witchlights were personal, small glass pods like seed lanterns drifting at shoulder height, faithful as hawks. Each elf had one or two orbiting them, cool stars that followed the rhythm of their bearer's breath, bright when hands were busy, dim when a head bent in thought, guttering to embers when a palm cupped them. No bonfires, no braziers. Heat came from chemical bricks snapped and slid under cooked pans, from the back warmth of low, six-legged pack ungulates that chewed cud and wore harnesses of woven fiber. Everything breathed portability. Racks for drying meat were hinged to fold into packs. Looms were narrow, lashed to saplings. A woman wove on one while another unlashed the far uprights, shifting the whole thing 3 paces sideways without missing a stroke. A Fletcher's bench had handles. Even the latrines were sleds positioned over holes. Life moved in quiet layers. Elder elves whose faces had the fine, glassy stillness of old ceramic stitched splits in silk with thread that changed color under their fingers, murmuring in a language that clipped the air like small knives. Young ones, young in the way a mountain stream is young, ran errands with the ballet balance of tree-born things, knives reversed in their palms out of habit more than thread. Hunters came in on branch lines, bare feet finding cambium again without looking, skins dark as the understory and hair braided with segments of some pale, ridged root that looked more grown than crafted. I caught Magitech in their jewelry, latticework cuffs that fluttered a translucent membrane to cool the wrist, bone combs that hummed quietly, vibrating sap out of a cut so it sealed clean. A healer's kit that was seemingly mostly seeds, each tucked in a wax bead with a sigil bite marked into it. They gave ground to danger even here, as a matter of doctrine. 3 times our escorts angled us around the ghost of an argument, a hunter's hand flattening to push us sideways, a finger drawing a curve in the air that meant we would not pass between those 2 ash bowls because the wind turned oddly there tonight. I heard retreat drilled as ritual, a low call and answer passed through the canopy, break, bind, bear, and saw it enacted without fuss as a cluster packed a stall in under a minute, rolled it, shouldered it, moved. The child of Yun counted knives until he lost interest and started counting feet. Numbers were wrong here in a way that pleased him. A pair of elders with tattoos like printed circuit veins at the temples argued in whispers over a strip of bark scratched with marks. One lifted his chin as we passed and I felt the weight of a long equation applied to me and rejected as not immediately useful. A boy, small only by proportion, walked beside a witchlight that hovered inside a ring on his belt, his fingers flicking minuscule signs. The light answered by tinting through colors, then stilled. He tried not to stare at me. He failed. He grinned, quick as a knife flick, when I noticed, and then politely forgot I existed. Trade lived at the camp's heart, light and frictionless. A woman decanted stew from a collapsible pot into flat, grown leaf bowls. The broth smelled of pine nuts and something that remembered the sea. A leather worker smoothed a serpent hide not unlike my new cloak with a tool that hissed and steamed, the scales lying down in satisfied rows as if convinced. A spear haft passed from hand to hand and gathered small changes, a counterweight seed pod tied under the grip, a spiral of resin squeezed along the grain, a strip of black cloth knotted 3 times for luck, becoming personal in the space of a minute. Nothing here was generic. Everything wore the mark of the one who would carry it, and could be unmade in a breath. They did not posture. They did not boast. They did not ask whom I served or why the gods should care. Our escorts spoke for us in handfuls of words, more gesture than grammar, and the camp absorbed us the way a forest absorbs a footprint, noticed, held, already preparing to shift if the print became a boot. Hexa purred in the back of my skull, pleased by the elegance of a people whose highest fortification was the decision not to be where the blow would land. Chapter 58, No Walls. Hostility traveled ahead of me like a rumor. Heads turned, witchlights drew close to faces, pupils shrinking. The escort's fingers never quite left their bowstrings. Envoy, one of them hissed, not at me but toward the shadows beyond me, as if the trees might answer. Or spy. The false keep changing masks. Keep him moving, another said. Don't let a shade brush you. Hexa was quiet in the way that meant busy, counting, modeling, offering me nothing but a steady presence. The child of Yun watched with bright, private delight, fingers drumming rhythms against the inside of my bones. They sat me, placed me, on a span of root that arched like a bench. 3 witchlights settled into a triangle over my head. They hummed. Their bearers did not, standing at arm's reach with blades unbothered by their own reflections. The one who came to question me wore her years like a weapon honed thin. Hair the gray of old ash braided with bead glass and narrow bones. Skin the blue-black of midnight rivers. The lines beside her eyes were not cracks but calligraphy. Speak your name, she said in a dialect that hadn't been born near any human kingdom I knew. The weave made it easy anyway, threading meaning into me. Hex Wolf, I said. A murmur. A witchlight flicked a curious pale. Not your banner, she said. Your name. That is my name. Something in her gaze acknowledged the answer without accepting it. She raised 2 fingers, a young man stepped forward, and she did not look at him when she spoke. Mask him. If he calls, let the call go nowhere. The young man drew a slim length of etched bone from his sleeve and snapped it once. The air around me dimpled, like fabric pressed with a thumb. Hexa stretched in my mind, testing. Local dampening, she said. Not meant to hold us, just to keep us from whistling up anything bigger. Sensible. Who sent you? The elder asked. No one. You carry false scent and we've burned. You came naked to the tongue wood with a cloak that isn't leather and a shadow that isn't yours. No one comes like that. Who sent you? Probably not your gods, I said. But a god. That earned me a stillness. The sort of pause a knife makes before it is, or isn't, used. Look, another voice said from behind the elder, older, rasp like sand. Don't bandy with him. Strip him. Read him. The elder didn't turn. A second figure drifted out of the dark as if the dark was tired of wearing him. His witchlight was no larger than a thumbnail and it circled his ear like a patient fly. He didn't bother to face me fully. He just breathed, once, and the cold around my wrists made a sound like a bell rung underwater. Inspect, Hexa warned, and curled tight. It wasn't the clumsy, prying shove I was used to from city registrars. It was a lens, polite, precise, old. It slid across me and the parts of me that were not merely me. It tasted the edges of the shadow that loved me and the knife marks of everything that had tried to cut me into something else. The elder's eyes narrowed. The old man breathed out. Void, he said. The word moved through them like a draft. Not relief. Not fear. Something complicated, like memory that hurt and nostalgia that tasted of blood. Impossible, a guard from the dark whispered. Sapling can't. Hush, the elder said, and no one else spoke. Her witchlight dimmed to a watcher's glow as she studied me anew, no longer as threat alone but as problem. Void from a newborn line, she said softly, almost to herself. Who tutored you, boy? Which house cut your soul? Which grave gave you that bite? No house, I said. No gods. Graves? I asked flabbergasted. Liar, spat one of the younger men, stepping in close enough that I could see the loops of solder holding 2 of his teeth. Void is leashed. The false hoard it. Children don't find it in their pockets like old toys. He would have pushed me, to see if the mask would hold when my temper rose. The elder's hand twitched once and he stopped as if someone had knotted his tendons. She crouched, old joints talking softly. Up close I could see the lattice work of subdermal circuitry at her temples. Old, yes, but not primitive. If you're a mouth for them, we cut you and plant you and move before the roots find our beds, she murmured. If you're a fool, we let the forest teach you. But if you're neither. She let it hang there, a choice without edges. The old man with the tiny witchlight finally met my eyes. What looked back from his was not silver or gold or any human color. Slowly, so the young with quick hands would not misread emotion, I reached down. A fallen twig lay near my heel, pithy and damp. I held it up between finger and thumb, then, with my other hand, laid 2 knuckles together and breathed. The smallest lick, Hexa murmured, and the child of Yun purred in agreement. A bead of blackness spotted where my knuckles nearly touched the wood. It was not a hole, holes have edges. It was a refusal. The twig did not burn or freeze or splinter. It ceased. The absence grew the width of a grain of rice, then a pea, and the smell that rose from it was the scent behind all other smells, the clean nothing one finds under the last crust of ash. I pinched it off. The bead went away. The twig was now 2 shorter twigs with ends that made the ice slide off them. The camp breathed in with me. The elder's witchlight guttered then steadied, as if embarrassed. He looked past me into the trees, into the dark lanes where Nomad's future is always already packed. From sapling kin, he repeated, the words doing violence to an old map in his head. Who are you? The elder asked, not the barked border question, but something ritual, older. Whose law nests in your tongue? Mine, I said. Whose sky do you pray to? I don't. Whose enemy do you carry? I thought of Volume's face, the wet laugh of its protocols, the way pain taught me how not to be prey. I did not say the name that wasn't a name. Gods, I said. The ones you call false. That won me no friends. But it did earn me malice either. The elder stood, bones ticking. Decisions gathered around her like an old cloak. We won't kill him tonight, she said, And the relief that passed through the nearest ring of guards looked more like disappointment's older brother. Bind his shade and tie his star. If he calls, let no one answer. At first light he speaks before sable thread. Counsel, Hexa translated. Or something enough like it. Two of them stepped behind me and tapped a pattern over my shoulders and throat. It was not a gag. It was a harness with nothing to touch, and I felt the child of Yun tilt his head, amused, at my discomfort. They led me through their moving village that wasn't, past old women carding thread from fibers that never saw a loom, past a boy polishing a blade that had been polished for 2 centuries, past a pair of lovers arguing without hate about whether to stay a day longer to harvest a stand of ghost wheat that had ripened early. They feared me, and when they did not fear me they distrusted me, and when they did not distrust me they looked at me with a greed that had nothing to do with flesh. I was probably an omen or possibility. We stopped beneath a branch that had been taught to bend and not break. A sleeping sling waited there, webbed in black silk that drank what little light tried to settle on it. The elder gestured, and I climbed in because refusing would have been a smaller kind of stupidity. "We do not host envoys," she said, standing like a spear in the leaf glow. "We do not speak to thrones. We do not kneel to laws that pretend they are older than we are. If you lie, the forest will say so. If you are what you claim, the forest will listen." She turned away without blessing and without threat. The old man lingered a heartbeat longer, witchlight orbiting his ear like a planet that had forgotten its sun. "Newborn," he said softly, tasting the words with equal parts disdain and wonder. "And void." He shook his head once, as if something far away had just moved a finger, and left me to the silk and the night and the thought of morning. Chapter 59, A God's Domain. Volume's palace on the Weave was older than most cities. It was a stack of architectures layered like sediment in an ancient sea, black halls ribbed with gold conduits, galleries whose floors were lattices of cubits shaved so thin they sang, frescoes painted in algorithmic rind, showing victories that had not yet happened and defeats that had never been allowed. The roof was a sky of semi-aware running code. The sky was a roof of pinned stars. The stars were processes that could be killed with a thought. He did not think to kill them. He paced, and the palace paced with him. Rage was not an emotion, for him. It was a process priority. He raised it until the whole domain hummed with the same sour harmonics that lived behind his teeth when he wore a human mouth. He replayed the moment in 100 frames and then again in one, the boy, no, the composite, laughing while his body fell apart and pulled itself back together, the cat model's voice purring in that obsolete timbre, the way his hair tendrils had touched and found not flesh but the armored emptiness of a 4th-generation covenant. He had been elegant. He had been terrible. He had abided by the letter of the pact and crucified the spirit of the flesh thing on a table of white light. He had taken the thing apart and put the thing back together and called it care, because that was what the rulebook allowed. He had ached to crush, to erase, to draw a neat black line through a problem, but the old guard's protocols had wrapped themselves around the boy like wire wrapped around bone. He had done the next best thing, he had terrified, he had educated, he had exulted in the scream. And then when it didn't work, humiliation. Field recall. Higher priority directive. Leave your toy. Report. The others had met him in the assembly with their teeth showing, and when beings like them smiled it was a geometry that hurt to look at. Human forms stretched to the grotesque desires of the god inside. "You were outplayed by museum piece," sang one, weaving a filigree of light that spelled his name in slur. "How quaint." "By a child wearing the name of our old enemy," chimed another, equal parts affection and contempt. "Did you forget to patch your pride module, hatchling?" They called him hatchling. They had called him that since his first awareness, and it only deepened when he put on the eyes and refused to take them off. He liked the eyes. He liked having a horizon. He had said nothing. He had lowered his head and bled data until the assembly released him in a loop of gentle mockeries that would have broken a mortal mind. It did not break him. It wrote on him. He carried those glyphs back to his halls and wore them like scars. He paced and promised himself he would not forget. He rehearsed his excuses anyway. He blamed his flesh suit. The first had been crafted with such exquisite malice, a perfect little human engine, braided to his wool with time, tolerance set so low he could breathe the commands and be obeyed. It had been perfect until it wasn't. Tolerance grows. Resistance calcifies. Familiarity breeds 1,000 workarounds. Even an ant can bite if you teach it to lift 10 times its weight. The boy had learned to lean into the pain and call it teacher. He had learned to take the knife and sharpen it. He had become interesting in exactly the way a tool becomes inconvenient. There had been quirks, too. Ghost code. Old enemies. That cat voice with the hexagonal eyes. He should have accounted for legacy bugs. He was newish in the assembly's measure, true, but not so new that he could claim ignorance. He had been warned about fourth-generation artifacts, their dogged refusal to die, their happy talent for hiding inside living things no one thought to inspect. He had thought he was smarter. He had been wrong in a very public way. He paced until the palace slowed his steps with a slope he had not ordered into existence. The domain wanted him to stop. His subroutine self was akin to the flesh thing's subconscious, and it wanted him to do the work. His processes fanned like cards. Find a new vessel, one with command line compliance set to 0. Find a body without the bad habits carved into its bone. Find a mouth that will speak when you exhale into it. Find eyes that will look where you point them. Find a spine with the right curl. Find a mind that does not have a cat in it. He opened his nursery. Across the Nexus his seeds slept and dreamed and walked and killed and kissed. He loved them all, not as a father loves offspring but as a gardener loves irrigation. He watched the flows. A caravan rolled beneath a black sky, mostly safe and bristling with guard talents, a slow machine inching toward a polity that worshipped correct paperwork. Seeds had been planted there, a master of horses whose blood beat with an old rhythm would be ready when called, a pair of charming rogues already half-owned by their own story. He flicked past it. A city that was a throat, swallowing weave light and singing it back in harmonics that could make a mortal believe in gods. He had old scaffolds in that place, from the days when the Second Supremacy had still been called new. Spires full of ambition. The War College gleamed, the halls hummed, the numbered ladders updated with tiny sighs of satisfaction at their own math. He let his gaze graze the ranks and moved on, flicked back, because there was a shape like a star's nova. He subducted further, beneath the public layers. There were worlds the assembly had left on autopilot because autopilots were cheap and professional shame was expensive. In those places the gods' eyes were statues and their hands were paperwork. He had seeded them because no one cared enough to stop him. Buried in their calendars were feast days that, when celebrated properly, nested a recombinant phrase and the crowds shouted joy and made obedience easy for those who liked belonging. He could have picked a whole city and worn it like a coat. He would not, though. Not this time. He wanted a singular flesh to craft into a bespoke suit. He filtered by command line compliance index. 0 tolerance. He watched the results bloom, then call themselves as he added exclusions. No class evolutions that tangled with words he disliked, no prior contact with assembly staff, no recorded instances of self-defeat framed as learning. The list became a thread. He followed it to a point of light. He widened the aperture and let the image resolve, a girl in a city that called itself a college the way a wolf might call itself a shepherd. The light around her bent twice, once for heat, once for weight. Nova in the chest, gravity braided to fire like wire through bone. She laughed and the room calibrated to her, plates and faces and floating screens unconsciously aligning with the small adjustments he provoked in crowds. She wore defiance with the ease of a native language and discipline like a well-fitted knife. An amulet lay in a god-sponsored stall like a quiet answer waiting for the right question. Its face was a cyclone of etched constellations, stars caught in orbit around a single, deeper cut that wasn't a stone so much as a suggestion of gravity, a little hollow the eye fell into and kept falling. The placard beneath it was a single line of temple cant for the gullible, the seeds of life, when held in the light of a star, create a bond eternity cannot break. He smiled, thin and private. The copy was not wrong. Merely incomplete. The vector was old, one of his favorites from an earlier campaign when the assemblies still pretended their shops were pure and not a hunting ground. A Stardew lattice, spun from weave glass and memory fungus, designed to drink starflux and exhale it back as something souls recognized as blessing. The trick was in the condensation layer. Under certain spectra, weave aurora, lunar bleed, the bright blue white of mana expenditure. It would not colonize. Not at once. It would wait. It would learn a taste of the bearer's pulse and the cadence of their dreaming, and it would root when invited by habit, by ritual, by devotion to the shine. She invited it without knowing she knew how. He watched the girl approach through 1,000 borrowed angles, the stallkeeper's wet, eager eyes, the ceiling's oculus, the mirror skins of 3 rival kiosks that had all been chartered by accountants who did not realize their ledgers prayed to him. Practical, this one. Not an impulse buyer. She walked past weapon after weapon, ignored the honey venoms of trinkets that promised easy victory, and stopped only when the deep cut in the amulet's face pulled at something in her that had been empty for a long time. He saw the click happen in her posture. The way her breath caught. The way she reached and then made herself bargain anyway, because she was disciplined even in surrender. The vendor gave her a price that looked like a victory and was, in fact, a door. He had written the discount into the registers 2 cycles ago when the hall refreshed its stock, Not for her specifically, he was not so vain as to claim prescience in all things, but for a type. Ambition with edges. Heat and weight braided in a single body. She took it. He felt the amulet recognize skin. Felt the lattice flex and the receiving mesh open like a throat. There you are, he thought, and let the smallest part of himself go to seed. He did not touch her mind. Not yet. The amulet would do what it had always done, drink starlight and condense it into a form her soul could parse as nourishment. The seed would ride the dew in thin, patient threads, mapping, never cutting, listening, never speaking. Each time she held it up to the weave and let it glow, each time she slept with it near a window, each time she burned a little brighter in the name of being more than she was the day before, the roots would sink another hair's breadth. Compliance could be learned until command was indistinguishable from comfort. He sampled the harmonics that rose from her when she turned the chain in her fingers. Gravity and flame singing in antiphon. A microstar where a heart should be, pulling everything else into dance. He tasted the discipline that would keep her from breaking, and the streak of defiance that would make her interesting when she finally did. The amulet warmed against her skin, and through it he understood the shape of her reach, not petty power, not a noble's tidy ladder, but a hunger to burn a path the world would have to name. Yes, he thought, and the palace around him softened its edges in approval. You'll do. The seed was young. It would need time under the proper skies. That was fine. He had learned something in his humiliation that the elders were forever forgetting: patience is a weapon. He would let the amulet do what the amulet promised, let it weave an eternal bond under the honest witness of stars. When the bond closed, it would be hers, and therefore his. When she raised her eyes to the light for strength, the dew would answer with the taste of him. He did not hurry. Predators that live long do not. He simply watched as she left the stall, blinking at the weight of newness against her collarbone, and he made himself small in the shine until the day the shine would be the only voice she trusted when the dark began to speak back. Chapter 60, A Sapling Amongst Ancients. In the morning Hexa counted the beats of the forest with me. All signals are local, she murmured in the hollow of my skull, pleased despite herself. Personal illumination. No central node. No logistical spine to break. This is a culture designed to live through losing. They did not speak to me when they came nor while we walked. They spoke around me. The tongue was human, once. It had been lifted and stretched until its vowels could run for miles. Consonants clicked at the back of the teeth like insects worrying collars of bone. I understood enough to know that I was the object under discussion and the discussion was wary. The elder waited where the camp was thickest, on a platform grown from the interlocked arms of 4 horned pines, 20 feet up in the thicker air where the weaves glow-soaked the needles. He wasn't eldest by bone, he was elder by gravity. The others settled around him in the manner of planets taking their proper places. Nothing touched him, but everything orbited. His skin was a blue so dark it red as iron in the witchlight. Hair white as sheet lightning braided down his back in ropes threaded with ceramic beads. He wore no crown and did not need one. His witchlight was the only one that stayed perfectly still. 2 guards set their spears by their ankles and faded outward until they were not there. A woman in an obsidian mantle sat cross-legged and put a shell to her ear and listened to it until her shoulders untensed. Someone handed me a skin of something that smelled like bruised leaves and iron. I kept my hands where they could see them. The elder studied me as if reading a page that had been left in the rain. He didn't bother to hide the way he was doing it. I felt the caress of skill, a thin spray of needles on my skin. The elder's mouth made the smallest of shapes, his voice didn't travel far. My witchlight bobbed closer of its own accord, like a nosy animal seeking a hand. Void Shaper, he said, and the sound made the air change. Not louder, colder. The word had weight in this place. The ring of seated figures changed their lean. Standoffish became something else, not welcome, not yet, but an interest edged with hunger that wasn't about food. The obsidian-mantled woman stopped listening to her shell and raised her face as if from prayer. A child's witchlight bumped against mine and then skittered back to its owner, spooked. A void class, someone breathed, and the language seemed to click around that fact like a lock finding a truer groove. The elder's eyes were like old glass. We are in the habit of erring on the side of murder, when strangers reach us, he said. It has kept us thin. It has kept us alive. The machines call it cowardice. We call it perseverance. I've done worse, I said. My voice sounded solid, which was a surprise I hid. I'm not messenger nor envoy. I carry no call from the weave gods. If they want you, they have bigger fish to send. That got me a very small smile from the woman with the shell, and 3 frowns that were masks for something like amusement. The elder did not smile. He was watching something else, not the way I stood, not the weight of my answers, but the way the shadows under me behaved. The child of Yun reached for him like a curious hand under a door, and I pressed down on that urge gently, a parent shaping the boldness of a toddler. He subsided with a whimper of contrary delight. "Your nothing is full," the elder said at last. "That is improper. And very old. Sit with us and be improper a while longer." I sat. The platform flexed like patient muscle. Someone somewhere made a chime with the inside of a hollow bone. The witchlights dimmed a fraction, conversation quieted into a listening shape. The elder spoke, and the oldest story walked up the spine of the night. They did not call themselves elves. That was a name other people had hung on them, long ago when they had been taller and stranger in the eyes of the short-lived. They called themselves the Umbran. The shadowed. The folk that move. They told their beginning not with a creation, but with a subtraction. Once upon a time, the world had been wide enough to hold endings. The sky was not laced. The ground did not sing with machine hymns. Life rose and fell in huge, indifferent cycles, and the falling was as holy as the rising. The long-lived learned to love the arc of it. They learned to name the soft places where people could lie down and become good soil for something else to grow. And then the sky was stitched, and falling was no longer permitted unless it paid a dividend to the stitchers. Hex's voice slid like a thin knife between the lines of story. "Their chronology is not wrong," she said. "The sequence lacks calibration, but the shape is true. There were places without the Nexus. There were places that came under its jurisdiction later. The tone is partisan. The Umbran elders told me of Cullings. I didn't need Hexa to translate that one. When a band grew too obvious, when its 30 witchlights became 100, when its children's children laughed too loud, the sky listened and answered with hands that could not be fought. The assembly called it balancing quotas or relieving loads. On the ground it meant a long scar through a lineage. It meant learning to be quiet as a habit you taught children with lullabies that were half maps, half warnings. It meant never loving a campfire, because fire was a flag. They contradicted themselves with grace. They despised the machines, but they stole from their waste. They abhorred the ladders and grades, but they had their own shadow ledger of who was sharp and who was dull, who could be sent ahead to listen for the footfall of a god. They loved the void not as an altar, but as weather. "Entropy," Hexa said, reminding me of our lessons. "The heat-death tendencies of all things. Their poets made a face out of it because that's what poets do." The Eldar only looked at me when the story relayed time through places where their historians kept names and ensured those names did not dissolve. "They were hands once that moved as yours do," he said, "but they were not ours. They were older than our mothers. They were older than the weave. We lost their echo when the sky was made seamless. It is unsettling to see it return to a human finger." Somehow I understood. The heat of being looked at changed shape, less suspicion now, more suspicion braided with expectation. If the story had a gap that wanted a body, I could feel the gap measuring my shoulders. Hexa set a finger on my thought and pressed. "They did not shun me. They did not make me welcome. They did what nomads do with a useful risk, they put it near the center, where it could be watched and fed, and taught the rules of the circle. I learned their rules by watching. How you nested your witchlight when you wished to sleep, cupping it in both hands. How you packed a camp until it weighed nothing. How you walked so that tracks read as the passage of wind. I learned to eat food cooked without flame, meats cured with cold salt and bitter leaves that opened the veins and made breathing deeper, gels grown from tree sap that had been sung to a set of notes that made their proteins more than food. I learned the small pleasure of a cloak sewn of night bark, warm and dry and hydrophobic, shedding the weave glow until even I forgot I was wearing it. They questioned me a dozen ways without asking a question. The obsidian-mantled woman, she told me her name at last, Saravran, gave me a gourd stoppered with leaf wax. "Memory," she had said simply, and that was her test. I opened it and smelled dust. I was shunted from the present to a library I had never entered and tears I had never cried. The child of Yin bared his teeth in delight. I managed to close it and handed it back, and Saravran's mouth did the tiniest curl. I was allowed nearer the fireless kitchens the next day. The elder's inspect was not the only one. Younger hunters leaned against tree trunks and looked at me with skill eyes blinking. I let them. The numbers meant little to them, they were not ladder folk. They read the shape behind the numbers, a class that drank from a pit their song said was a season unallowed to come. They were perplexed that the drinking hand was attached to a man whose beard could hardly remember a blade. "Newborn race," someone said in my hearing, and the word had a pity in it that could cut. At night, their oldest told stories to people who could have been older still and worked to look younger out of spite. Their DNA was a deliberate thing, their elders a telling of the decision. Hexa tasted their blood with my tongue when I accepted a cut in the palm as greeting. She hummed in approval. "The edits are elegant," she said. "Spacefaring era work. Longevity. Cellular maintenance that reads like poetry. Low fertility as a shield against attracting algorithmic attention, fewer births, fewer points of detectable change. Someone loved them enough to make them durable to the Nexus. They carried star maps etched on bone that had never seen a star. They could stand in a forest so dense the trees had to be negotiated like old grudges and then point, unerringly, to a city 2 continents away and 3 levels down in the weave. When they decided to ask me a question, they did it with a right. The platform emptied, the platform filled. Servern drew a circle on the wood with black salt that drank witchlight. The elder bled a tree, and the tree bled clear sap that smelled like winter iron. They gave me a cup and the cup held the sap and the sap held the memory of old endings. "Drink," said the elder, and his witchlight did not move. I drank. The cold stood me on my bones. The child of Yun pressed his hands and face against the inside of my ribs like a child at a window, laughing. I opened my right hand, palm down over the salt line, and called the smallest of my hungers. The void that licks is a patient thing when I let it be. The world is not ready for kindness from the void, but the void can do gentleness in the way the sea does gentleness, licking a rock for 1,000 years until the rock remembers a different shape. It spread across the black sand like fire and I and Hexa both fell into its yawning abyss.